Josh, they just want the interpreters want to make sure you speak into the phone because they can't interpret.
Can you switch over? Is there a little thing for you to click on for the council table? Yeah. That's right. I'll figure it out.
Just a second.
Josh, show that to them. Show that to them.
Yeah, hold on.
All right, ready? I don't know what's going on, but.
don't know if you turned that one on or not. It's the little line, there's a switch down at the base of it by your thumb. Maybe you need to spin it around. There you go. Good thing this isn't a radio show.
All rise for the jury.
All right, thank you. Be seated. All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're back on the record, CR 2018-00-1296, State versus Cooksey. I see Mr. Cooksey is here with Mr. Reinhardt and Mr. Little, Mr. Maxwell, Mr. Salmons, Mr. Baumann are here for the state. Record should reflect the presence of the jury in its entirety. It is time for opening statements. Mr. Maxwell.
Folks, good afternoon. Throughout the course of this trial and our time together, you're going to hear the names of individuals. We're off to a start here. Try this again. One moment here. Let's try that again. So, throughout the course of this trial, you folks are going to hear the names of individuals. Andrew Remillard, Parker Smith, Salim Richards, LaTorri Betford, Christopher Cameron. You're going to hear about a lady named Maria Villanueva, Renee Cooksey, and Edward, or as some folks call him, Ed, none. You're going to hear about these individuals, their lives, and you're also going to learn that all of these individuals here on the screen have something in common. And the thing that they have in common is that they were all vulnerable at the time they were killed. Now, as you might expect, individuals leading their own independent lives were vulnerable in their own unique way, but vulnerable they were in their own way at the time they were killed. Andrew and Parker were buddies, friends, best friends. They were together sitting in a car, for example, when they were killed, talking. Salim had just picked up some groceries at a store and was making his way over to his girlfriend's apartment to see her when he was confronted in a parking lot and shot and killed with the groceries in his hands. Corey, you'll hear, was intoxicated at the time. And he had the misfortune of crossing paths with someone who was armed with a handgun. Christopher, also by himself in an apartment complex at the time that he was shot and killed. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Maria, you'll hear, simply had the misfortune of parking her car in a parking lot at her boyfriend's apartment complex, where it just so happened that there was a man off in the shadows, the dark shadows, who approached her and set forward a chain of events that she or no one could really foresee coming. Renee and Ed, they were killed inside of their own apartment. Each of these individuals were vulnerable in their own unique way, as the evidence will show at the time of their killing, their deaths. Folks, this case is not really going to be about how these people were killed, where these people were killed, or frankly, when these people were killed. These things are important, and we'll talk about them, and you'll hear evidence about all of that during the course of this trial. But that's not really the focus, or not really going to be the focus of this trial. The focus of this trial is one of those classic whodunits. And the evidence will show the person who done it, if you will, is this individual over here, the defendant, Cleophus Emmanuel Cooksey. And he done it, if you will, when he walked up to Andrew Remillard, who was sitting in his own car in the driver's seat, pointed a gun at his head at close range and pulled the trigger. And he did it again, seconds later, when he pointed the gun, as the evidence will show, at Parker Smith, who was sitting in the passenger seat, shooting Parker in the face, killing him. He did it again several days later when he confronted Salim in an apartment complex as Salim was carrying those groceries, shooting Salim in the chest. He shot Tory Beckford, as the evidence will show, twice in the head. He did it again 2 days later when he confronted Christopher Cameron in an apartment complex, shooting Christopher twice, once in the neck and once in the abdomen. And we'll talk about that in a moment. He did it again about a day later or so, thereabouts, when he approached Maria after she had just finished parking her car, made her get into the driver's seat of her own car, and drove her car with her in it out of that apartment complex. And he did it again, as the evidence will show, a couple of hours later, after he had sexually assaulted Maria fired 3 rounds into her body and left her in an alley nearly naked, dead. And he did it again, as the evidence will show, about a day later, when he put a gun up to his mother's head and pulled the trigger, and then shot stepdad, Ed, in the face twice, killing him and her. The evidence will establish these facts throughout the course of the trial. You'll hear direct evidence, testimony from witnesses who saw and experienced things, and you're going to hear a lot of circumstantial evidence that connects this individual over here with the crimes that he has been charged with. And you will come to know this individual through the course of this evidence by his deeds. This case involves 6 incidents. We're going to talk about these incidents for just a moment, about what actually happened, as the evidence will show, in each one of these separate incidents. And then we're going to talk for a moment about how that evidence connects up with this individual sitting over here. Sometimes it makes sense to start at the end, because what seems like the end is often just the beginning, and that could not be more true in this case. As you will hear and see with that 6th incident, the time that this incident happened, detectives really didn't know or have a connection with a suspect in the previous incidents. They gathered that information after this incident and connected it up in retrospect, if that makes sense. So we're going to start with incident number 6. Throughout the course of this trial, we're going to present information to you through the witness stand, through the exhibits, incident by incident, and try and keep it separate. It will be really important as you consider this information and consider this evidence, number 1, to keep it separate by incident, because you're going to hear from a lot of witnesses. And then number 2, just as important, to keep a big picture perspective on things and how the evidence pieces together and fits together. Because again, at the end of the day, the issue in this case is whodunit. When we're talking about this 6th incident, it involves, as I mentioned, a lady by the name of Renee Cooksey and a man by the name of Ed, or Ed Nunn. This incident happened on December 17th of 2017, and it happened in Phoenix. Obviously, some folks here are a little newer to the valley. Some have been living around the valley for a while. Nevertheless, this is an area of Maricopa County. The incidents that we're going to be talking about in this case occurred in Phoenix and in Glendale. First, we're going to talk about 6, as I've mentioned, in Phoenix. And we're going to see on here in a moment, as this map shows us, a little closer area towards the east side, central Phoenix towards the east side, near the State Route 51. This is where Renee Cooksey and Ed Nunn lived together. Partners living together in a relationship, 2-bedroom apartment. And you'll see in just a moment where this apartment is at. Specifically here, roughly the major streets being Camelback and 12th Street. Okay, so you can see the address on there, on Highland. Their apartment is directly above where that black number 6 is at. One of the first witnesses in this case that you'll hear from, Natalie Schuler, Natalie Blair, now that she's married, lived directly across the way. Natalie will tell you what she heard, what captured her attention on the night of the incident. She heard some loud bangs, called 911. Police officers came. The first officer to respond, Officer Offman, showed up. Thing to keep in mind, too, about this time frame, as we talk about this was right when police officers, the police agencies, were rolling out their body cams. So some officers had them, some didn't. Glendale officers had them, more or less. Some of the Phoenix officers had some did not. You will see body cam footage at different parts of the trial, but not all officers had them. Officer Offman did not. But what you will hear in this trial is that he turned on his audio recorder before he approached, or as he was approaching, this residence. And that captured his interactions and what happened. And that will become very important in this case. Nevertheless, as he is walking up here to this apartment, he approaches the apartment. That door right there is closed at the time, both doors. The main door and the screen door are shut closed. He's approaching this apartment. And he bangs on the door. And the reason he bangs on the door is because he sees a large amount of blood on the outside of this apartment. Fresh blood coming down the steps. So he knocks on the door. Phoenix Police Department continues knocking on the door. 5 minutes goes by. Eventually, after knocking and announcing, police, open up, police, and he'll testify and you'll hear from him, he was concerned about what was going on inside of this apartment because, again, as he's looking at this, he's not seeing any shell casings on the outside, bullet strikes, or anything like that. So he's concerned that all of this action happened inside of the apartment. So he's banging on the door. Well, about 5 minutes or so later, a person, this individual, the defendant, opened the door, cracked it a little bit. Officer asks him, "What's going on?" "There's blood all over." And the defendant says, "There's nothing going on, sir." He asks the defendant, "Let me see your hands." That's what they're trained to look for, is the hands. "Let me see your hands. Let me see your hands." He sees the defendant toss something off to the side. "Let me see your fucking hands." And you'll hear this on the recording. "Let me see your hands." The defendant showed him his hands, and the officer had him come outside. "Who else is in there?" "No one, sir." "Why is there blood all over the door?" "Because I cut myself," is what the defendant told him. "Let me see your hands." He's looking at the hands. There's no cuts on the hands. The defendant says, "I washed them off." But there's no cuts on his hands. "I'm better now. It washed off." "Where did you cut yourself?" He's looking at the hands. Well, he didn't see anything on the hands, and so he tried to detain the defendant at that moment in time. "Turn around. You're not under arrest. I'm just detaining you. Relax." The defendant becomes very agitated at that point. "You don't control anything. You don't control anything." And the officer tells him, "Get on the fucking ground." And he pulls out his taser. And you can imagine what happens next, because the defendant is not listening. And he gets tased, and he goes down. Officer Offman puts out over the radio this incident. "I've got one at taser. I need units." And the police show up quickly. They're en route. One of the next officers that shows up has a body cam, which picks up right where Officer Offman's audio recording stops. At that moment, the defendant becomes irate. He starts going off about how he works for the FBI and how Donald Trump told him to do things. And he goes on and on and on. And he's yelling and he's screaming because he is being told to comply. And he does not want to. Well, officers make their way inside of the apartment. And they see a lady with a huge hole in her head off to the side of that front door area. And they immediately put out 901H or 901 Henry, which is the code for a deceased person. Immediately upon entering this apartment, they see a man, Ed, who had also been shot and was laying right next to Renee in the front area of this apartment, which is covered in blood. A layout of the apartment. We'll look at more photos during the course of the trial. But Ed and Renee are laying there next to each other, both with gunshot wounds to their head, both dead before officers could even arrive. As the officers make their way in, they do what's called a protective sweep. They go in to make sure there's no other persons in there, there's no other people who are alive that need help, and they didn't find anyone else in there. So at this point in time, when the defendant comes out of the apartment, he is the only alive human being, as the evidence will show, that came out of this apartment. His mother and stepdad dead inside. Natalie, as you might expect, gets spoken to by detectives. They interview and speak with residents. What did you hear? Things like that. And she'll come in and she'll testify. And she heard loud popping noises, which drew her attention to the front area of this apartment. And when she went to look out front, she saw Renee. The screen door to that apartment was closed. Saw Renee facing the door. So you can imagine Renee on the ground, facing the screen door, looking out, clutching her shoulder or her face, something like that. Remember, it's dark out, evening hours. She appeared to be alive. And at that point, Natalie goes back and retreats to the inside part of her apartment. They call 911. Shortly thereafter, 30 seconds or thereabouts, she hears yelling between two men, one of whom she recognizes as Ed, saying, you're the devil, things to that effect, get out, followed by more gunshots. One of the individuals you'll hear from in this case is an expert, or a blood scatter pattern type expert. He'll talk to you about the photographs and what the evidence shows and how you can piece together some of the positioning of people when they were shot based on that evidence. Mike Meislich, he'll come in and he'll talk with you about that. Based on that testimony, the photographs, and what Natalie says, and others that you'll hear from, the state would submit to you, and the evidence will show the following. Number one, the screen door was closed at the time the defendant shot his mother for the first time. Number two, Ed comes out of the bedroom, which you'll see some photographs that would support that, and where he was at the initial shooting, the initial gunshot. And as the defendant directs his attention towards Ed, Renee tries to open, and does in fact open, that screen door. The defendant shoots Ed once in the head, and Ed goes down. At that point, the defendant turns his attention back towards his mother, walks up to her, and shoots her in the head. And that is a fatal injury. At that point, the defendant reaches out, closes the screen door, closes the outside door. Both doors are now shut closed. He then turns his attention to Ed and fires one more round into Ed's head. You'll be able to listen to what Detective Meislich has to say, along with some of the photographs and things like that, to see how the blood ends up where it's at, or open door, and the sequence of events. And that will become important in this case. One other thing to note about this particular incident is at the time of the defendant's arrest, he had a what appeared to be a gold necklace on. That necklace, ladies and gentlemen, will be very important in this case. So keep that in mind as you consider the evidence. You'll hear from the medical examiner's office. We're going to look at some photographs first, but you'll see a handgun on the couch off to the right. You'll see a shell casing down here at the bottom. That will become an important part of this case. A shell casing by the front door. A shell casing on the kitchen table. We'll talk a little bit about ballistics in just a moment. And then you'll see across the way, blood on the wall, higher up on the wall. And you might wonder, how did that get there across the room? Well, when you look down, and what the evidence will show is Renee's purse, blood. That purse had been flung across the room against the wall. And it's now directly below where you see that blood on the wall in the slide before. The gold necklace the defendant was wearing, as I've mentioned, that will become very important in this case, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Detectives would process the evidence. Little did they know at the time what they were in for and the connections that they would find. And as they were doing that, the medical examiner's office conducts autopsies. Renee had a gunshot wound to her right earlobe. It went through her face and out. The next one, a gunshot wound. This was a significant injury to her head. That bullet goes through her brain, her head, down and lodges in the opposite side of her neck. And that was immediately fatal, as the medical examiner will tell you. It went downwards. In other words, down, the bullet, the trajectory. We'll talk a little bit about soot or stippling, and that can kind of help you gauge about how far away someone or a shooter is, whether it's a close range, indeterminate range, or in some cases, a larger distance. These are close type injuries, gunshot wounds. Ed, as you'll see, had 2 gunshot wounds as well. He had one to his left cheek, which went through and lodged fragments lodged in his nose. As you might imagine, a projectile, when it hits something hard, can break up. So he had projectiles through his nose and face. The second injury, gunshot wound that Ed had, was the one across his face, his eyes. It was close, it was downward, front to back, and it lodged in his back. It literally went through him and lodged in his back, where they retrieved the projectile from Ed's back, the right side of his body, in his shoulder area. So, you'll hear from detectives, you'll hear from crime scene folks, you'll hear from civilian witnesses from this 6th incident. But the evidence will establish through the course of this evidence, or through the course of all of these witnesses and circumstantial evidence and things of that nature, that the defendant is the one that shot and killed his mother, Renee Cooksey, and Ed Nunn, her long partner. Now, we're going to start next with number 1. This incident, as you will hear, involved Andrew and Parker. Happened on November 27th of 2017. It happened in Phoenix. As I've mentioned to you, these two folks here, Andrew and Parker, were friends. They're buddies. They were sitting in a car, talking, presumably, at the time that someone walked up to them and shot them in the head. This happened nearby. You'll see where, over here, off of Indian School and 16th or thereabouts. We'll look at a map here in a moment. At the Speedy Cache, they're sitting in a parking lot. It's late at night, and they're talking. They're just talking, catching up in this parking lot. When the defendant walks up, points a gun at Andrew's head, and pulls the trigger. And then moments later, as Parker turns, his head now facing the defendant, pulls the trigger again. You might expect late at night in a parking lot of a Speedy Cache, there's not a lot of witnesses. Well, see some photographs. There's a Circle K across the street, and there's some homeless folks around. Parker made his way out of the car after he was shot, where he died, face down in a parking lot of a Speedy Cache. Andrew, as you will see and as you will hear, died sitting in the driver's seat of his own vehicle. There are 2 shell casings, 2 gunshot wounds, one to Andrew and his head, one to Parker and his head. You'll hear a couple of witnesses. Civilian witness Jesse Allen, who was homeless at the time, told the detectives, etc., that he was, quote, high as fuck when this happened. He was with a couple of females, approached the car, saw blood, and immediately made his way over to the Circle K, prompting a 911 call, prompting officers to show up, which you might expect at that point in time. Detectives then come. And you see 2 dead people in a car in the parking lot of a Speedy Cache. By the time the officers got there, there were no suspects around. The suspect had fled into the darkness of the night. No one saw him shoot these people. And detectives were left with a question. Who could have done such a thing? Who could have done such a thing? Well, they'll find that answer out after they investigate Renee and Ed's homicide, their murder. Just like you heard with Renee and Ed, the medical examiner's office conducts an autopsy. And you will hear from the medical examiner. They'll tell you about the injury that Andrew had. 1 gunshot wound to his head. Left to right, it goes through his head, literally, the round, lodging behind his ear. And he died as a result of that. You'll hear about Parker. 1 gunshot wound to the face. Remember, Parker is in the passenger seat. The car is facing towards the jury box. When his friend gets shot first, you would expect, naturally, your common sense, would expect the person to look. And he looked. And the round hit him in the face. Officers processed that crime scene, by the way. No prints of an investigative value, no DNA, no broken glass. Just those 2 shell casings at that moment in time. And 2 dead people, both with gunshot wounds to their head. Rounds going downward again. Remember that. Stippling. They were close contact type gunshots. We'll talk more about this incident in a moment. The second incident involves Salim Richards. He's the individual, as you know, that had just picked up some items at the grocery store, and was carrying them in his hands, going to see his girlfriend. Happened on December 2nd of 2017 on the west side in Phoenix. And you'll see here, it's a larger apartment complex, 43rd and Indian School. That little yellow area, kind of where it happened. We'll look at it close up here in a moment. There are, again, pieces of evidence, timing involved with this that will help sequence what happens here. This incident, Salim's incident, happened at about 7:45 or thereabouts in the evening. And you'll know that based on 911 calls. Okay, they report hearing yelling, gunshots. Officers come, they find Salim, he's dead in the parking lot. That yellow car there will be important. It's kind of like an anchor point for you about where this incident happened. You'll see some items off to the left we'll look at in a moment. And around that corner, you'll see Salim's body off in the distance where he was laying dead. Salim gets shot, as the evidence will show, over by that yellow car. Again, groceries in hand. You'll see some evidence of the groceries. And a shell casing. You might expect, consistent with what happened with Andrew and Parker, by the time the officers got there, the suspect is fled, no longer around. Who could have done such a thing? Well, you'll see how that pieces together in just a moment. One of the things to keep in mind about Salim is that he is a security guard. That's what he does for a living. And he's armed. He always is armed. And he had a Glock as a weapon. And off to the side right there, that yellow marker underneath of that car is a gun holster. Well, there is no gun there. You'll also hear that Salim had a gold necklace that he liked to wear. And that will become important as well. Just like before, the medical examiner's office conducts an autopsy of yet another dead person. And they will tell you that Salim had one gunshot wound to his chest. The round goes in, as you'll see here in a moment, upper left chest, goes left to right. It goes through his body, through the upper part of the lung, the aorta, the right upper lung, and lodges in his second rib, or thereabouts, where you see that circle off to the left side of the screen. This is more of an indeterminate type of a distance. There's no soot, there's no stippling. He shot at a little bit greater of a distance, but shot one time, and he died in the parking lot of this apartment complex. That's Salim. You'll hear, when we talk about this in a moment, about cell phone evidence and text messages and things like that. That will become important in this case as it relates to this incident. Next, we have incident number 3. This is the incident involving LaTorri Beckford. This happened in Glendale, December 13th, 2017. LaTorri, as I indicated to you, the evidence will show was intoxicated. Was under the influence, not alcohol, but PCP or some other drugs. You'll hear about this. He was acting kind of crazy. And LaTorri had the misfortune of coming across someone that was armed with a handgun. And that person shot LaTorri twice in the head, close distance. It happened in an apartment complex, common area, over by an electrical box. This apartment complex, ladies and gentlemen, will be very important in this case. We'll come back to this apartment complex several times. As you'll hear and as you'll see, the defendant likes to visit this apartment complex. This is where he comes to sometimes. You'll hear about a Maryville market. We'll talk about that in a moment. You can see the address in Glendale. LaTorri, 2 gunshot wounds to the head, died on scene. You'll hear from some civilian witnesses. John Jennings, Elena Rushing, Sierra Fivrek. They were friends with the victim. They knew the victim, LaTorri. They'll tell you, John, for example, will tell you, they were around shortly before the shooting happened. They went to that Maryville market with Elena and Sierra. On their way back, they heard 2 gunshots. They ran around the corner, as you might expect. And they saw the victim lying on the ground, dead. They saw a individual with a Glock-style gun in his hand walking away from the victim and towards them. Described the male to the officers as a person in their early 40s, late 30s, 39 to 40, that range. Bald, thin beard, blue t-shirt, blue-white bandana, which he was putting over his face. You'll hear from some of these folks throughout the course of this trial in this particular incident. This is an apartment complex, ladies and gentlemen, that does not have individuals that are friendly with the police, if we're going to be just direct about it. There are many witnesses, civilian witnesses in this case, that do not want to cooperate. They will be coming in to testify because they're subpoenaed. They're not coming in out of the goodness of their heart. Some of them, you'll get to evaluate all of them. Some of them may remember things. Some of them may choose not to remember things. But we'll see how that goes. Nevertheless, individuals, particularly folks at this particular apartment complex, not super friendly with the Glendale police officers. Crime scene investigators show up. They process the scene. There are shell casings. There's a lot of blood. And we'll look at all of these and a lot more photos in detail throughout the course of this trial as it relates to this particular incident, number 3, LaTorri Beckford, a man who was shot in the head twice. Another dead person. The medical examiner's office conducts an autopsy. LaTorri had 2 gunshot wounds to the right side of his head. One, the right cheek. It literally goes through his brain. Lodges on the opposite side of his ear. They're close range, it's up close, it's personal. 2 gunshot wounds in Latorre, dead. By the time the officers get there, the suspect is gone. And they're still left with the question, who could have done such a thing? Well, we move on to the 4th incident. And in that 4th incident, it involves a person by the name of Christopher Cameron. And Chris, or Christopher, you'll hear, had actually texted or sent text messages with the defendant the day of and in the afternoon prior of his eventual death. They were going to meet up because the defendant was apparently going to buy a small amount of marijuana, again, usable quantity of marijuana from Chris. And when Chris shows up with his backpack, the defendant had a handgun and tried to rob Chris. Chris gets shot in the process twice. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Now, thing to keep in mind about this incident, it's literally right next door from incident number 3, like less than a block. At another apartment complex, 5045 North 57th Avenue, also in Glendale. We'll look at a little bit closer up view about what happened here. See in that yellow box, those are apartments in that field, that will become important in this case. Because that's where Chris met the defendant. With a handgun, the defendant in his hands. Chris ran for his life after he got shot. You'll see some evidence here about where the initial confrontation happened. Down the way here, near the end of that building, you'll see a projectile in the ground. And off to the top part of here in that field, there's some more evidence that we'll look at in a second. Clothing. That's where Chris fell to the ground. And the defendant, the person chasing after him, was right there with him. But instead of rendering aid or helping, the defendant took, as you will see and as you will hear and what the evidence will show, took his backpack. Chris had already been shot twice at this point. He did not die immediately. And that will become important because, again, as you know, this is Glendale. They all had body cams on at the time. And when those officers came, they captured Chris's last words on video as he's lying there in a grassy dirt field of this apartment complex. Backpack gone. The other thing, coincidentally, that happens here, we'll talk about this, you'll see evidence, and you'll hear from Sergeant Dawkins in the Glendale Police Department. The reason that's important is the sergeant, as he shows up to this crime scene, comes into contact with someone who says, hey, my cousin's been shot. Help. Sergeant's like, where? And trying to figure out in all this commotion where this was all at. Well, that person, who is also on body cam, who you will see, watch with your own eyes and hear from the sergeant, is identified as this defendant. Sergeant face to face with this man who had no backpack with him at that moment. Chris, as I've mentioned, after this confrontation happens, runs away. The defendant chases after him, takes the backpack, and flees. But before he meets up with the sergeant, eventually, at that gate, from the side of the apartment complex, the defendant tosses the backpack onto the roof. Maintenance worker finds the backpack on the roof. and notifies the police about it, who then show up, process the backpack, find some of Chris's items in the backpack. But when the sergeant sees the defendant shortly thereafter, and we're talking a matter of minutes, the 911 call, for example, you'll hear 7:22 in the evening. Sergeant Dawkins, there on scene 2 minutes later, 7:24. You'll hear from some witnesses. Charles Johnson, for example, who, you'll hear, saw Chris running and a man chasing after him. You'll hear from, for example, Stacy Williams or Hunter Sapphire. Saw this man, a man, bending down and taking Chris's backpack as Chris laid in that field with 2 gunshot wounds. Well, see some of the evidence. There's a shell casing that will become important in this case. Chris's phone, his ID, that fragment, that round. You'll hear that Chris had one injury that was through and through, so no round in him, and the second round, as you'll hear, was recovered from his body at the hospital because they did transport him to the hospital and trying to save his life. He didn't die instantly at the scene like the other folks. That's the 4th incident. Again, another dead person. The medical examiner's office conducts an autopsy. The medical examiner will tell you that Chris had 2 gunshot wounds. The first one, not immediately fatal. He was very fortunate after that first one. It went through his neck, but didn't hit anything, bones, any major arteries and things like that. And the medical people will be able to talk to you about the specifics. But nevertheless, it went through him. Was not immediately fatal. His right neck went right to left, front to back, and downward, indeterminate. No stippling. The second one, however, was that second gunshot wound. That was to his right abdomen, stomach. Right to left, front to back. You'll hear, for example, that second gunshot wound goes through the right side of his abdomen, right lobe of the liver, the hepatic artery, hits the interior vena cava, left renal vein, head of the pancreas, and lodges into his 12th vertebrae. EMS folks transported, as I've mentioned, Chris to that hospital nearby. They tried to save his life, but Chris died as a result of his injuries. That's Chris. That's the 4th incident. And now we have number 5, involving a lady by the name of Maria Villanueva, who, as I mentioned to you, her only choice that started this thing was parking her car in a parking lot out in Glendale as she was going to see her boyfriend. She had texted her boyfriend. He'll come in, texting him, eating up. She was on her way over to see him. She had came into that complex. She had parked her car. And you'll see a map here on Bethany Home and 67th Avenue in Glendale, where this happened at. You'll see a red 5. As you'll hear, this is not where Maria dies. She's taken from this apartment complex in her own car. There's video surveillance, ladies and gentlemen, that show this happen. A man approaches from around where that red 5 is at, walking down towards the bottom part of that map where Maria had parked her car. She had gotten out of the driver's seat. He approaches her. The video will show Maria getting into the passenger seat, front passenger seat of her own car, and that man getting into the driver's seat. And that car driving out of the apartment complex parking lot. No one will hear from Maria ever again after that moment. You'll hear that Maria arrived at this apartment complex around 8:45 or 8:44, thereabouts, maybe a little bit before, a couple minutes, a minute before. But the defendant walks up, or the stand, as you'll hear, walks up. And that's when Maria is taken from this apartment complex in the passenger seat of her own car. Leaves the apartment complex about 8:51, 8:50, thereabouts. A couple hours go by. Well, one of the things that's important in this case, and we'll look at this again in a moment, is the cell phones. We'll talk about why that's important. Folks have their phones on them. It's always interacting with cell towers. So you kind of get an idea about where people are going and what they're doing and how long they're at particular locations. Even when you're not using your phone. We'll talk about that, as I mentioned, in a moment. But as Maria leaves in the passenger seat of her own car, the state would submit to you about 11:30 or so in the evening, a couple hours later, down in South Phoenix in an alley, after she has been sexually assaulted, the defendant fires 3 rounds into her body and kills her, and leaves her half-naked body in the alley. 11:30 at night in an alley. Maria's body off to the distance. We'll look at photos of that later. We don't have to see them now. What we will look at now are the 3 shell casings, ladies and gentlemen, that were around, so literally surrounding Maria's body. Those shell casings will be very important in this case, as will other things, like the defendant's DNA. Police officers respond to this location. They start processing the scene. Again, this happens in Phoenix. Okay, we have a kidnapping in Glendale, killing in Phoenix. As you might expect, the police agencies are not talking to each other. These things are kind of moving down parallel paths, if you will. The reason for that, as you'll hear, is people are looking for Maria. And we're now back to this number 3 scene that I told you about earlier. This is where LaTorre was killed, the place the defendant, as you'll hear, likes to go. Well, people are trying to get a hold of Maria, her children, over the course of the night and early morning hours. Calling, texting. Well, maintenance worker, you'll hear, answers the phone, talks to one of Maria's children, which prompts Glendale police to respond to this location. Her phone was in a dumpster in this apartment complex, along with her car, which had been abandoned in this apartment complex. All of her clothes, including her underwear, in the dumpster. Her car, a Kia Sorento. One of the things that you'll hear about is what they found inside of this car. That will be very important in this case. That blue shirt right there, big time important as you consider the evidence in this case. That shirt, and we'll talk about this, had the defendant's DNA on it, along with some others. Some of Maria's jewelry. We'll look at that shirt in a moment. Another dead person, the medical examiner's office conducts another autopsy. Who could have done such a thing? Well, you'll hear about the gunshot wounds that Maria had to her body. The first, or one of the gunshot wounds, to her left cheek. Front to back, left to right. You'll hear specifically about directionality of this wound and where it ends up. In the back of her head. That second gunshot wound, right there on her neck, down below, ends up again in her right shoulder area, backside. Third gunshot wound, her chest. It goes through her left breast. There's a defect in the bra where the ground hits, and it lodges on the other side of the chest. 3 gunshot wounds, 3 shell casings, a dead person in the alley named Maria Villanueva. That's incident number 5. So, you're going to hear a lot of witnesses from each one of these respective incidents and what happened. And it'll be, as I mentioned, important to keep things straight from incident to incident, but also consider how this information overlaps or connects with each other. And that's what we're going to talk about for just a moment now. There are different pieces of evidence in this case, ladies and gentlemen, that tie this defendant to these crimes, unmistakably so, as the evidence will show. Starting with the ballistics, the gun. Some of you have familiarity with firearms, others do not. So just briefly, semi-automatic handgun, as you can see on the screen here. When you pull the trigger, firing pin hits, backside of the shell casing, it propels it out the barrel of the gun, and the shell casing comes out to the side. Okay? Gets left behind. Consider that with like an old style revolver, which doesn't leave those shell casings behind. They stay in that cylinder thing that just kind of turns around. This case involves obviously a semi-automatic handgun, or handguns, as you will hear. There's different types of cartridges, or different parts to a cartridge, and you'll hear testimony about all of this. You'll have a projectile, you have some casing, that powder and propellant, and then your primer. All part of a cartridge. The backside of that cartridge, or that casing, I should say, is where your forensic scientists can look at evidence as relates to these casings that are left behind, for example. And that's what happened in this case. So, for example, as it relates to Andrew and Parker and Celine, you'll hear from a forensic scientist at the Phoenix Police Department. His name is Michael Beto. He's been working at the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab for 17 years. He'll talk with you about his background, his training, and experience. He'll talk with you about what's called the AFTE method, or the AFTE theory, AFTE, and the different types of conclusions those experts can draw based on their examination of firearm-type evidence. An identification, an exclusion, or an inconclusive. And he'll get into the specifics with you and talk to you about the different possibilities. Well, he looked at those 3 shell casings, and he formed the opinion based on his training and experience and his looking under the microscope, which he'll talk with you all about. He likes to talk about those kind of things. 28 degrees of magnification. You can imagine all of the intricacies you can see under the microscope, and you'll see photos of that. He identified these 3 shell casings here, 2 one at Andrew, one at Parker, and one at Celine as being fired from the same handgun. He formed an identification, which obviously forms a connection between these two incidents. Okay, well, what else? As you consider the evidence, look at number 6. You're going to hear that that gun that was used to kill Renee and Ed belonged to Celine. It was registered to Celine, the guy from the number 2 incident. That was Celine's Glock, found inside of the apartment where this defendant had walked out of the apartment door, and Officer Offman was knocking on the door, tossed off to the side the gun. Defendant walks out, gun on the couch. That gun used to kill Renee and Ed. That gun, as you'll hear and as you will see, belonged to Celine. Well, as I've mentioned, and I get a little ahead of myself, that gun, as I mentioned, connects with the murder of Celine, or excuse me, with Renee and Ed. Well, when you look at the other 3 folks here that we haven't talked about yet, Tori, Chris, and Maria, a different forensic scientist at the Phoenix Police Department, Erin Hickson, years of experience as well, will come in and will talk with you about what she looked at in this case. And she looked at the shell casings under the same process using that AFI theory of identification, and she formed the opinion, based on her training experience and her observation of these shell casings, that they all came from the handgun that's on the couch, Celine's handgun, an identification. Each and every one of those shell casings. So, you have ballistics as one part of this case. The other thing that you'll hear, and that I forgot to mention a moment ago, is Mr. Beto looked at the projectiles that were recovered from the medical examiner from inside of Parker and inside of Andrew and inside of Celine. And he was able to identify those 3 projectiles as coming from the same handgun. That handgun, ladies and gentlemen, never been found. Don't know where it's at, but it came from the same handgun, nevertheless. And that's the important part of this, and that's what the evidence would show. Next, DNA, also a critically important part of this case for different reasons. Number 1, starting with Maria. Folks, you will hear that the defendant's DNA was in the outside area of her vagina. She was left in the alley. We'll hear about some other DNA evidence, including Celine, connecting to Celine. That gold necklace that I mentioned, Celine always had it on. Folks at the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab analyzed DNA, and they found a mixture involving the defendant, which you would expect if he's wearing the necklace at the time that he gets arrested, but also of Celine. And you'll hear from individuals, at least one will tell you that Celine wore a necklace very similar to that. And you'll see photographs or a photograph or 2 of the defendant wearing that same necklace, but a mixture of DNA nonetheless on that necklace that comes back to both the defendant and Celine. Provides moderate support for Celine's DNA on that necklace. What else? Well, that blue shirt. Remember that blue shirt that was found in Maria's car, that back seat of Maria's car. That blue shirt, ladies and gentlemen, had Christopher Cameron's DNA on it, along with the defendant's DNA on that shirt, Christopher Cameron's DNA on that shirt. In the abandoned car, left at that number 3C, where the defendant liked to go. We're going to talk about what happened next, because remember, at the time that that sixth incident happened, involving Renee and Ed, detectives really didn't have an appreciation for all of the other things that had happened before. They didn't have that connection. They processed the scene, but they didn't take items like clothing and things like that that weren't connected necessarily, as they understood it at that moment in time, to other murders. They didn't know about those other murders connecting to this defendant. Well, they went back a couple days later and they processed the scene again. And they took items from a bedroom, clothing items. One of those items being a dark blue colored styled Nautica polo shirt, collared shirt. That shirt, ladies and gentlemen, inside of the apartment where Renee and Ed were killed, shot in the head, had LaTorri Beckford's DNA on it. Are you okay, sir? Okay. Had LaTorri Beckford's DNA on it. Inside of that apartment. The other thing that you'll hear, not necessarily connected to DNA, but car keys. Maria's car keys to her Kia Sorento inside of that apartment. Inside of the same room where LaTorri's shirt is at. Maria's keys that he took, as the evidence will show. You're going to hear from an individual with the FBI, Jeff Bennett, or Special Agent Bennett. And he works as a special agent with the CAST unit, or Cellular Analysis Survey Team, I believe it's what the acronym stands for. Nevertheless, he works for this group of special agents, or works with them. And these are individuals who are highly technical in their job. They look at phones, they look at cell tower stuff, information. They're very knowledgeable as it relates to these things. And this is what he does. And he's looked at these things, the phones in this case, because again, you'll hear the defendant had a couple of phones during this 2 to 3 week, 4 week window of time. A couple of phones. Those will become very important in this case. As you might expect, nowadays, most folks are familiar with phones, but when you have your phone on, it's always searching for the strongest, cleanest signal. It's called racking and stacking. It's looking for the cell tower that can give it the strongest, cleanest signal. Even when you're not on it, using it. And that will be important because the cell phone providers, the carriers, the Verizons, the T-Mobiles, the AT&Ts, you name it, they keep records of all of this. And those records can be used to map certain things. Detectives applied for search warrants to get that information. A judge granted that, or those search warrants. They got the information. Special Agent Bennett looked at that information. And he concluded, based on his looking at that information, that the defendant's phone, or one of his phones, take your pick, was in the area of various crime scenes, all of them but LaTorri. And we'll look at those in just a second. One of the things that you'll see as it relates to phones in just a moment is a lady by the name of Jennifer Souffle. Jennifer is a person who the defendant was having sexual relations with during this time frame. The reason this is important is on the night of the first incident, so the incident involving Andrew and Parker, the defendant was making his way over to Jennifer's apartment, sent her text messages. It establishes a timeline for when these things happened. He's on foot. You'll hear the defendant does not have access to a vehicle. Goes on foot. He makes his way over to Jennifer's apartment. She did not want, apparently, to engage in relations with him, and he left. And that is important because it establishes when, or that time frame of when, the defendant is traveling on foot, which just so happens to align in that same time frame that Andrew and Parker are both shot in the head as he's presumably walking back to Mom's apartment on foot from Jennifer's apartment past that first crime scene going to number 6. Again, text messages and things like that will help establish a time frame for you. And we'll look at those things in the course of this trial in detail. As I've mentioned, the cell phone evidence in this case puts the defendant's phone at crime scenes at or around the time of the murders. He's using the phone. For example, you'll hear about a lady named Lena Vasquez. She's important because that's the person the defendant calls and texts with immediately after Salim is killed. Can you pick me up? Well, she's picking him up by a Circle K that is a block away from Salim's apartment complex where he's shot and killed. You're going to hear from other civilian witnesses like or other witnesses. First, Sergeant Dawkins, who sees the defendant at Christopher Cameron's crime scene. But you're going to hear from other people like Ashley Purnell, for example, a civilian witness who arguably connects the defendant to a couple of different scenes because he's the person, or she is the person rather, that the defendant calls when he needs a ride to certain places. And she gives him a ride to various places. Ashley will tell you she was living at that Urban 55 apartment complex, that number 3 apartment complex. She knew Latore. She had seen him around the apartment complex. He acted a little crazy. But on the day Latore died, she'll tell you that she met a guy named Playboy. That's how he introduced himself to her. I'm Playboy. Well, just so happens that Playboy turns out to be this defendant, as the evidence will show. He was smoking a cigarette on that electrical box. And this is the daytime hours leading up to Latore's eventual killing later on that evening. She gave Playboy a ride to the dollar store. She drove him back to that apartment complex, number 3 location, after giving him a ride to the dollar store. Later that afternoon, evening, she exchanged phone numbers with him. She had Playboy's phone number. Well, you might expect they texted and they talked. That information, that evidence will become important in this case. Later on in that evening, on the evening of Latore's murder, she drove herself to a phone store. And upon coming back to that apartment complex, she had learned that Latore had been killed. Fast forward a day to when Christopher Cameron was killed, number 4. The Playboy asked Ashley for a ride, which just so happens to be right after the time frame of when Christopher was shot and killed. And she picked him up at that Speedy Cash on the corner, not the number 1, but a different Speedy Cash. She picked him up. She drove him over to a liquor store, which is just so happens to be right across the apartment complex where Maria was kidnapped. So driving her from that number 4 scene up to Bethany and 67th at a liquor store, A1 Liquor. Drops him off, gets the liquor, she takes him over to that apartment complex, and he ditches her or leaves her. She doesn't see him again that night, but again, the same night that Maria is killed, or kidnapped and subsequently killed. She'll tell you that she saw this defendant, Playboy, the next morning at, what do you know, Urban 55, that location number 3. So after Maria is killed and left in the alley, she sees this defendant, Playboy, at that same apartment complex where Maria's car is found, that number 3 location. She's an important witness in the sense that she will connect the defendant to a couple of different scenes. She is not super cooperative, as you might expect, but she does have information to share, and I expect we'll hear from her in the course of this trial. And then lastly, in that number 6 scene, obviously you know, you will hear and you will see evidence this defendant was arrested at that crime scene, number 6, coming out of the apartment with 2 dead people inside, his mother, Renee Cooksey, and her partner, Edward Nunn. There's a whole host of evidence in this case that connect this defendant. DNA, ballistics, other pieces of evidence like car keys, Maria's in a bedroom inside of that house or that apartment belonging to his mother. That's what this case is about. That's the evidence in this case that connects this defendant to all of these crimes. So as you listen to the evidence, as you consider all of the information, keep an open mind. Don't make any decisions until you've heard from all of the witnesses, until you've heard from all of the attorneys, until you've received the judge's instructions. Keep an open mind. But after you've heard from the witnesses, the evidence, we're going to ask you to hold this defendant accountable for what he did and find him guilty.
All right, thank you. Looks like time for our afternoon break to me. We will take 15 minutes and be back. Remember the admonition, keep an open mind. We'll see you in 15 minutes. All rise for our jury.
Who pulled the trigger? That's going to be the question in this case. We're not going to contest that 8 people died from gunshot wounds in 2017. But it's the who, why, and the circumstances regarding each one of those 6 incidents that you learned about. That is going to be the issue in this case. And we're not going to agree with the state on much with regards to the evidence here, but we do agree with them. Who did it? Who was the person behind the trigger? My name's Rob Reinhardt, if you don't remember. Along with Adrian Little, we represent Cleophus Cooksey Jr. An innocent man, presumed innocent, sits here today innocent. I want to thank you for being here, for going through this process. I'm sure the reaction of receiving a jury summons isn't met with a whole lot of joy from anybody. It's not a convenient obligation. Our schedules are disrupted, both personal and work. And then, we had the 200-question questionnaire, all sorts of intrusive questions about your personal lives, beliefs, a commitment for the end of the year. But our judicial system is a critical part of our democracy. I don't know if too many people think of it that way. We think of our democracy as going and voting. But our judicial system is a cornerstone of that democracy. And millions of people a year perform their civic duty by sitting on juries. They take that oath to perform this vital duty. And you directly participate in this democratic process. The right to a jury by one's peers is the cornerstone of our judicial system, essential for our democracy. Our system depends on people who are not only willing to serve, but also to be fair and impartial. There's a difference between willing to serve on a jury doing your civic duty and taking that step of being a fair and impartial juror. And that was this whole process that we all put you through over the last few weeks, okay, to see if you could be a fair and impartial jury. So, on behalf of Cleo, and really for everyone in this courtroom, we thank you for your service today. Now, when we talk to you about being fair and impartial, the court, the prosecution, us, we all talk to you about some of your most basic constitutional rights we have. And you all swore under oath that you could follow those rights, hold the state to their burden. You wouldn't be on this jury if you couldn't. And believe me, I'm going to remind you throughout this trial about your oaths, about your obligations to follow the law, hold the state to its burden. Just had an hour-and-a-half presentation by the state. I'm too old for slideshows. The technology just doesn't suit well with me. So I'm just going to be talking with you this afternoon. Everything that the prosecution said to you in that hour-and-a-half is not evidence of anything. That is the state's theory of what's going to happen and what they hope the evidence shows. Now, those rights that we've talked about, again, are just to be clear. These 16 charges against Cleo, they're not evidence of anything. He's pled not guilty, which means the state has to prove each and every element of each and every charge beyond reasonable doubt. It's their burden. It doesn't change. It never moves over to the defense. The law does not require Cleo to prove his innocence. Defense doesn't have to do anything. Every person is presumed by law to be innocent. Cleo, as he sits here today, is innocent. There's other rights that we talked about. The right to have a lawyer, face your accusers, defend the charges against you. And right to remain silent. You all promised us, said you can follow those laws. Okay, we're going to hold you to those. Might remember the comment from Judge Brain about Mr. Little and I could just put our feet up on the table and drink coffee if we wanted to. We're not going to be doing that. We are going to be testing the state's evidence, all of it, and their witnesses. In this country, we don't convict people based on hunches, guesses, or stories that don't hold up under examination. We have an adversarial system for determining the truth, which means sometimes people are examined in a way that you might think is aggressive, maybe not friendly. If either myself or Mr. Little does any of that, hold it against us. Don't hold it against our client. We are simply exercising his right to a defense of these charges. And folks, this is going to be a long trial. What gets said in openings is not evidence, and I really don't expect you months and months from now to remember what got said here. And I'm not going with the PowerPoint presentation because simply, ladies and gentlemen, we're at that stage where it's just prove it time. That's what it is. It's time for the state to prove their case. Now, we talked a lot about penalty when we were talking to you in jury selection, okay? That needs to be put out of your thought process in this stage. Okay? The court will instruct you, and I think is in your preliminary instructions, that whether a defendant is guilty or not guilty, you don't consider punishment. Okay? So, Cleo's pled not guilty. He's presumed innocent. What you heard from the state is their theory about what happened over 3 weeks in 2017. The question that's going to be put to you is, can the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt these charges? Okay? Each and every element of the charge. And the ultimate question regarding the most serious charges before you is, who caused their deaths? Who pulled the trigger? That's the one thing in an hour and a half you really didn't hear, where that evidence is going to come from. With people that identify Cleo as the shooter. Not circumstantial evidence, but people that saw Cleophus Cooksey Jr. pull the trigger that killed these 8 people. You didn't hear either in that hour and a half statements on why these crimes occurred. What was the motive for these basically random and unrelated offenses? You didn't hear anything about premeditation either. The state made statements that in incident number 1, Mr. Cooksey just went up and shot him. But there's no rhyme or reason to any of that. That first-degree murder that we talked a lot about in jury selection requires reflection. It requires premeditation. And the evidence in this case is going to be lacking on that part. What you did hear, though, is that the police worked backwards. They went from incident number 6 and then worked backwards. But in doing so, ladies and gentlemen, the investigation becomes biased. It becomes closed-minded on all levels of investigation. This is something that we call confirmation bias. Some of you may be aware of it. It just occurs when a person, or in this case, organizations, form a belief and then use that information selectively to confirm that belief. If you think you have a murderer, then it's a lot easier to suspect him of doing other murderers, okay? And the investigation becomes biased. You'll find that bias not only through the investigation of the case, but also in the so-called scientific analysis that's being done with items of evidence, okay? The method of identification for firearms mentioned by the state is anything but scientific. It's simply an unreliable subjective opinion of an analyst employed by the police department. They look at something and they go, does it look the same? It is totally subjective. Okay? Now, this is one trial, but actually 6 separate investigations. Okay? There's a lot of charges that have been filed in this case. There's going to be lots of witnesses and lots of evidence. But each count charge is a separate and distinct offense. And you have to decide each count separately on the evidence. You can't be influenced by your decision on one count to influence your decision on another count. When I mentioned earlier it was prove it time for the state, that's where we're at. That's what we're going to make them do. Okay? The prosecution has to prove each and every element of these crimes. They have to do it from there, ladies and gentlemen, from that witness stand. Okay? Bringing in witnesses, bringing in exhibits. Okay? It's important to pay attention to the prosecution's case. What does come in? And what doesn't? Who do they call to testify? And who do they not call to testify? You consider all the evidence, to consider what is going to be missing. And I'm especially going to ask you to pay attention to what transpires on cross-examination as much as what is presented and elicited by the prosecution during the direct examination of their witnesses. Okay. And speaking of witnesses, ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be some, we're just going to flat out call them sketchy. Just sketchy witnesses. Drug addicts. People that are going to freely admit they're on drugs the night that they are going to come in and talk about. You're going to have to weigh their credibility, okay? And the judge gave you some instructions on that you consider what testimony to accept, what to reject. Okay? You evaluate the witnesses, and you evaluate them for things like the quality of their memory. What do they remember from 7 years ago? Their manner while testifying, their motive, bias, prejudice. Is there anything that contradicts what they say? Okay? You are the judges of those witnesses. You determine their credibility. It's going to be all your jobs as jurors to make a determination whether the prosecution has reached that highest burden in our system. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. I told you I was going to be brief, okay, because it's just time for the state to put on their evidence and prove their case. But I want to leave you with a final thought. There has to be some natural reactions and feelings when you're reading about this case, hearing about these cases. Okay? You might be thinking, well, thank goodness, the police got the right guy. That person's off the street. But you're making assumptions that you're just not able to make, ladies and gentlemen. You just can't. Y'all swore to us that you're not going to make those assumptions, okay? You can't assume the police got the right guy. Because just because they're police officers, they're given no greater weight. You have to judge their testimony, what they did. You can't assume that the prosecutors got it right, that they've charged these charges. Because the charges aren't even evidence. You can't consider what the state even told you in their openings. You cannot consider that as evidence. Because what we say up here is not. Again, the evidence comes from that chair, through those witnesses. Okay? And I'm going to remind you of Judge Brain's trick question. Okay? You guys don't know if he's guilty or innocent because you haven't heard anything. It's just wrong. Cleo sits here, presumed innocent. And I'm going to ask you all to uphold Cleo's rights, as you would for anyone charged with a criminal case, despite these allegations against him. Okay? To uphold the laws that existed from the formation of our country and our cornerstone to our judicial system. As you sit here today, Cleo's innocent, not guilty. He's presumed innocent by law today, tomorrow, and going forward. And he only is not innocent if the state reaches that highest level of proof in our judicial system to prove these charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you.
Thank you. State have a first witness.
Yes, Judge. State calls Natalie Blair to the witness stand.
I'll do it. Ladies and gentlemen, while we're waiting on that, you should have some question forms in your binders. If you, as you're listening to the testimony, have questions that you don't think were asked, feel free to write them. Ma'am, come up here close. Right up here. Yep.
Hi there.
There you go. Talk to her.
Can you please state and spell your first and last name for the record? Natalie Blair, Natalie, Blair, Boair. Thank you. And raise your right hand for me. You do solemnly swear the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God? Yes.
All right, now make your way around to the witness stand. There should be water for you if you get it.
Thank you.
Mr. Salmons? Judge.
Natalie, would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hi, I'm Natalie Blair.
And Natalie, try to stay by the microphone here. I'm going to be asking you some questions today about a shooting that happened back in December of 2017. Back when that happened, did you have a different last name?
Yes,
What was your last name back at that time?
Schuler.
Have you gotten married since that incident?
Yes,
Can you tell us what kind of work you do?
I'm a teacher.
What kind of teacher?
I teach kindergarten through 8th grade gifted students.
And how long have you done that for?
10 years.
Natalie, back in December of 2017, were you living at an apartment complex at 1320 East Highland Avenue?
Yes.
And who, if anyone, were you living with at that complex?
At the time, my fiance, Adam Blair.
And that's who you're now married to?
Yes.
Just the two of you?
Yes.
Do you recall when you moved into that complex?
In April of 2017.
And I call it an apartment complex. Can you tell us, is it apartments, condo, townhouse?
It's more of a condo.
Single story, multiple stories?
Single story.
And how many, if you recall, how many bedrooms and bathrooms did your condo have?
Our condo had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom.
If you know, did all of the condos in that complex have kind of the same layout as your condo?
Yes, I believe they did.
And you told us what you do for a living. Were you doing that back at that time in December of 2017?
Yes.
What was your kind of normal schedule like?
I worked 5 days a week. I left around 6:30 and came back in the early afternoon.
Well, do you recall, I know it's been 7 years or so, do you recall what unit number you lived in?
No.
We'll get to that in a second. If you walked out of the front door of your condo,
Yes.
was there another condo that was directly across from you?
Yes.
Do you recall what number that was?
60?
Do you know the people that lived in the condo across from you and Adam?
I didn't know them well.
Had you seen them before?
Yes. We
How-
talked in passing.
And who all lived there?
There was a couple living there originally when we first moved in.
Male, female?
Yeah.
Younger, older?
Older couple.
And did they have a son that also lived with them?
Not initially.
At some point, did they have a son who lived with them?
Yes.
And you said that you talked to them in passing. How did that work?
If they were sitting out on the patio, we would have brief conversations about the weather or just, hey, how's it going?
Natalie, I just handed you exhibits 962 and 963, which are photographs. Do you recognize the individuals in those photographs?
Yes.
And who are they?
Those were my neighbors.
Elena, can you connect to my laptop? And when you say neighbors, are these the neighbors that live directly across from you?
Yes.
And for the record, I have 962, sorry, Judge, the state moves to admit 962 and 963.
No objection.
962 and 963 are admitted.
These were the two neighbors that lived across from you?
Yes.
And I think you said this already. Were they living there in that condo when you and Adam moved in?
Yes.
And did they live in that condo all the way up until December of 2017?
Yes.
At any point, and I'm not going to talk about the incident that we're here to talk about, but other than that, did you ever see the two of them arguing or fighting with each other?
No.
You indicated that at some point while you were living there that they had a son who also started living in that apartment.
Yes.
Did you ever interact with him?
I did.
Tell us about that.
Similar, we interacted in passing. We had a few conversations that were a little longer than just how's the weather.
Do you recall how he introduced himself, like what name he introduced himself by?
He introduced himself as Cleo.
And you said it was kind of in passing. Do you recall the substance of any of the conversations you had with him?
I was leaving for a music rehearsal and we talked about that and he expressed interest in music. And so he was telling me about looking at him up on YouTube and seeing what type of music he did.
How many times would you say you had conversations with Cleo?
Probably 2 or 3.
And just give us an idea, how long were these conversations?
No more than 3 to 5 minutes.
Was he friendly?
Generally, yes.
Did you, after he asked you to look him up, did you ever look up his videos?
I did.
And did you find them?
Yes.
Is the individual who you recall at some point living in the condo across from you, who introduced himself as Cleo, is that person currently in the courtroom?
I don't know. I don't see. Yes. Sorry.
Okay. Natalie, can you tell us where that person is at and what they are currently wearing?
Over here in a black suit or with a blue tie.
Can you get a little bit more specific? Blue ties.
Sorry.
It's okay.
It's like a light blue shirt.
And what race is the person?
Black.
Your Honor, may the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant.
She has.
Natalie, I just handed you what are marked as exhibits 957 and 958. Do you recognize those?
Yes.
And what are those?
These are pictures of the condo complex we lived in.
Are those kind of aerial photos of the
Yes.
complex? Does it appear to be how you recall the complex? I know it's from overhead, but is that how you recall the layout of the complex back in 2017?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move to admit 957 and 958.
No objection.
957 and 958 are admitted.
Yeah. So Natalie, I have exhibit 957 up on the screen, and you can probably see that there's a number 6 and an arrow pointed at a location. Do you recognize that location?
Yes.
And is that where you and Adam were living together back in 2017?
Yes.
Do you recall, and I don't know if you know north, south, east, and west, but kind of what part of the complex you and Adam's condo was?
We were in the northwest side of the complex.
Oops. This is exhibit 958. Now I'm going to hand you a laser pointer.
Okay.
If you can you, using the laser pointer, point out where your condo was?
Right here.
Okay. And just for the record, the witness is pointing at the second building from the top towards the left part of the diagram.
Yeah.
Did your front door face north or south?
South.
And the apartment that you're talking about where the couple lived and Cleo lived, where would that apartment or condo be on the diagram?
It's right here.
Okay. And the witness is pointed approximately where the 6 is on the diagram. Did their front door, what direction did it face?
It faced north.
So your front doors faced each other.
Correct.
Natalie, I just handed you 3 photographs, which are marked as exhibits 965, 966, and 969. Do you recognize what is in those 3 photographs?
Yes.
And what is in those photographs?
This is the sidewalk in front of our condos and the entrance to my neighbor's condo.
Do those photographs show how you recall that area and that condo back in 2017?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state moves to admit exhibits 965, 966, and 969.
No objection.
955, 6, and 9 are.
Natalie, I have exhibit 965 on the screen, which appears to show kind of a sidewalk. What are we looking at here?
This sidewalk runs between our 2 condos, and those 2 entrances are the patios in front of them.
I'm going to come back to this photo in 1 second. This is photograph or exhibit 966. What is this showing?
That would be my neighbor's apartment, the front patio.
And appear to be Christmas lights on the top of it?
Yes.
Obviously, we're talking about December. I'm going to go back to 965. Is that same condo with the Christmas lights kind of on the right side of that sidewalk?
Yes.
And for the jurors who are looking at the big screen, I'll tell you it's a lot sharper up on the TV, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Judge. So if you could, with your laser pointer, can you actually see where the door of your condo would be on that photo?
Yes, I can. It's over here. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, maybe try that.
Here?
All right. Directly across from the condo with the Christmas lights?
Yes.
And if I go back, if you know, Natalie, if I go back to this diagram, and I have now 958 up on the screen, that photo that shows the sidewalk with the condos on both sides, where is that on this diagram?
It's right here where the sidewalk is.
Okay. So kind of the second sidewalk, or not, excuse me, sidewalk kind of in the very middle of the diagram, just above where the 6 and the arrow are?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So I want to ask you some questions about what happened back on December 17th of 2017 at your apartment or your condo complex. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to?
Yes.
On that date, did you hear some sounds that drew your attention?
Yes, I did.
What kind of sounds did you hear?
I heard 3 or 4 popping noises.
Do you recall where you were when you heard these popping noises?
I was in my living room watching TV.
Complex we've been talking about?
Yes.
Give us an idea, because we haven't seen kind of the layout of these condos. Where is the living room in comparison with the front door?
The living room is right inside the front door, and then the kitchen is right across. It's connected to the living room.
So you're in the living room watching television. What time of day are we talking?
In the evening.
Was it dark outside?
Yes.
You hear 3 or 4 popping sounds. Where does it sound like they're coming from?
They sounded like they were coming from out in the front of my apartment.
What did you do?
I got up and went around to the kitchen window and looked out.
When we were looking at kind of the front of the condos and we had the neighbor's one up on the screen, there was a front door and it looked like there was a window on each side.
Yes.
Did your condo have that same thing?
Yes.
If you, Natalie, were in your apartment looking at the front door, which window did you look out? The one to the right of your door or the one to the left of your door?
To the right.
And did you have blinds on your window?
I did.
So what did you have to do anything to look out?
I just lifted the blinds and looked through them a little bit.
And when you did that, what did you see?
I saw my neighbor, the female neighbor, on the ground. The main door was open, but the the screen door was closed, and I saw her on the ground.
When you say you saw her on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
was she inside of her condo, outside of her condo?
She was inside the screen door.
How far was she from the screen door?
She was probably a foot or two from the screen door.
And which direction is she facing?
She was facing out towards the sidewalk.
So facing you.
Correct.
And how is she positioned?
She was on the ground, kind of on her hip, leaning on one arm and grabbing her shirt or her chest.
Do you recall which arm she was leaning on and which hand she was using to grab her?
She was leaning on her right arm and grabbing with her left.
When you look out and you see this, the female neighbor from across the way, are you hearing anything at that point?
Not at that moment.
Are you seeing anybody else besides your female neighbor?
No, I did not see anyone else.
About how long did you look out your window for?
Briefly, probably 5 seconds.
What did you do at that point?
I went back into my apartment further to get my husband.
And that would be Adam.
That is correct, yes.
Where was Adam in the apartment?
He was in the bathroom.
Can you give us an idea where the bathroom is in your apartment?
So from the front door, if you go directly back, there's a hallway and a bathroom right there. It's maybe 10 feet from the door.
Is that the only bathroom in the apartment?
Yes.
What happens when you get back to where Adam is?
I tell him that I heard popping noises and saw our neighbor. And while we were having that discussion, we heard more noises.
What did you hear?
We heard
Objection calls for hearsay.
Did you hear words or noises?
popping noises.
How many more popping noises did you hear?
3 or 4 more.
And in addition to the 3 or 4 more popping noises, were they similar sounding from the first one?
Yes.
Did you hear anything else?
There was some yelling.
And could you tell where the yelling was coming from?
It sounded like it was outside, similar to the direction of the popping noises.
And from where you were in your condo at that point, well, let me ask you, are you now back kind of in the bathroom area with Adam?
Yes.
Could you make out what any of the yelling was or what was being said?
It sounded like someone was shouting.
Objection, hearsay.
Could you make out the words? It's a yes or no.
Yes, sorry.
And Judge, I would argue this is clearly a present sense impression and excited utterance as well.
It may be. Come up.
I'm going to repeat my question, Natalie. I think my question was, could you make out anything that was being said during the yelling?
Yes.
And what is it that you could hear?
I heard someone shout, get out, and something about Satan.
You talked earlier about the fact that you had talked with your neighbors in passing and that you had had a couple of conversations with the defendant, Cleo. Could you tell whose voice it was?
I knew who I believed it to be.
Who did you believe it to be?
It sounded like the older gentleman who lived in the apartment.
Give us an idea, Natalie. You hear the original popping sounds. You go to the window. You told us kind of what you saw. and then you indicated you went back to find your now husband, Adam. How long was it before you heard this additional yelling and popping noises?
From when I left the window,
Correct.
probably 2 minutes.
And what did you hear first? The yelling and the get out, something about Satan, or the second set of popping noises?
I heard the yelling first.
Do you recall if there was a break in time from the yelling to the second set of popping noises, or did the popping noises happen when the yelling ended?
It was very brief if there was a break in time.
What did you and Adam, if anything, decide to do at that point?
Adam went out towards the windows and I stayed behind to call 911.
And did you call 911?
I did.
And did you eventually talk with a 911 dispatcher?
I did.
Natalie, I just handed you what's marked as Exhibit 946, which is a CD. Prior to you testifying today, did you have an opportunity to review what is on that CD?
Yes,
And did you recognize it?
I did.
And what was it?
It was the 911 call I made that night.
Did you recognize your voice on the recording?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state moves to admit Exhibit 946 and to play it for the jury.
No objection.
946 is admitted.
Phoenix 911, where's your emergency?
Hi, we're on 1320 East Highland Avenue in the Highland Apartments. We just heard some really loud explosion type sounds across from us in apartment 57 and some screaming.
Okay, are you in apartment 57 or is the noise coming from apartment 57?
We're across. We're apartment 60.
Okay, but the noise is coming from 57.
From 57, yeah. It's
Okay.
quiet and dark now.
How many minutes ago did you hear the noise?
Probably within 5 minutes ago.
And you heard,
We heard probably 3 or 4 loud explosion sounds, like maybe light bulbs exploding, kind of a loud popping noise like firecrackers or something, and then a lot of screaming.
like screaming like somebody's in pain or screaming like laughter?
Like a man yelling, "Get out of here." And then when I looked out the window, there was a woman. She was on the ground. She looked like she might have been hurt. I don't know.
Is
But
she
she was
still on the
inside.
ground?
She's not. She's inside the apartment. They have a screen door that they sometimes leave open. They've shut their door now. But she was inside the apartment on the ground.
Okay. Give me just 1 second. And what, okay. Give me just a second. I'm getting officer started, okay?
Okay.
And the male, could you tell if he was black, white, Indian, Hispanic, Asian?
Our neighbors are black.
Okay, how old is he? Does he look?
Probably in his late 50s.
Okay. And how tall is he?
How tall do you think he is? Maybe 6 foot.
Okay, and is he thin, medium, heavy set?
Medium.
Okay, any weapons?
Not that I've ever seen.
Okay. Could you see what color shirt he was wearing?
No, I only saw the woman.
Okay.
I didn't see. I just heard his voice after I went back
Okay.
into my back room.
And the female, what race is she?
The African American.
Okay, and how old is she?
Probably around the same age.
Okay. And go ahead.
I know they have a son who's younger who lives with them.
Okay. And can you tell me how tall the woman is?
She's probably 5'5", about
Okay.
my height.
And is she thin, medium, heavy?
Heavier.
Okay. And did she have any weapons?
Not that I saw.
What color shirt was she wearing?
I think white.
And could you tell what color pants?
No, she was down on the ground, and it was through a screen door.
Okay. And they have one son that lives in the house. How old is their son?
He's probably in his late 20s, early 30s.
Okay. Do you know if he's there now?
I'm not sure. I actually haven't seen him recently.
Okay. And do you see the female?
Not anymore. They've closed their doors and windows.
Okay. I just need you to keep you on the phone in case the officers have any questions, okay?
Okay. My phone is about to die, just in case it cuts off. Do you want another number that?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
224-246-0005.
Okay, give me just 1 second, okay?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. On the ground. And then the guy was yelling. That's so sad. Yeah, mhm.
Officers are arriving. Let me know if you see them, okay?
Okay.
Did you hear anything else?
I haven't heard anything else. It's really quiet and dark now. We did earlier hear some car doors slamming, maybe like someone left.
Okay.
But we're kind of holed up in our house, or our apartment right now.
And I'm sorry, what apartment again did you say? 67?
57.
57?
Yeah. That's their apartment.
Do you still see the woman on the floor?
No, they're all closed up right now. Their doors are closed and windows and everything.
Okay.
I'm not sure if, I didn't hear her scream in pain. I just saw her on the ground by the door.
Okay. Was she awake?
She looked like she was sitting up, but she was awake, yeah. I think, I don't know, I just saw some flashlight. I think that maybe they're walking up. Yeah, they're here.
Okay, you see the officers. Okay. All right, I'll let you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Natalie, I want to ask you some follow-up questions now that we've had an opportunity to listen to the 911 call that you made back on December 17th. First of all, I think you asked earlier when I asked you about the unit numbers that you thought you were in Unit 57. Yeah. Now listening to that recording, was it actually your neighbors that were in Unit 57?
Yes.
And you and Adam were in Unit 60?
Correct.
I forgot to ask you this before, but when you described originally hearing the popping noises while you were watching television, and then you said you went and you looked out the window, first of all, when you saw the female on the ground, your neighbor, were you looking through the screen door?
Yes, their screen door was closed and I could see her through it.
So the screen door was closed, but the front door was actually open?
Yes.
Okay. And were the lights of the apartment on or off?
They were on.
During your 911 call, we heard you tell the 911 operator that when you're talking to her that now the lights were off and the door was closed. Tell us about that.
By the time the officers arrived, the apartment was closed up, the lights were all off, and you couldn't really see anything.
And you say by the time the officer arrived, it sounded like by the time you're kind of talking to the 911 operator.
That's correct.
So did you go and look out the window again at some point?
I did.
Do you recall when that was?
At some point into the phone call a little bit, I went out and looked out the window.
How about your husband? What is Adam doing while you're doing all this?
He was out in the front of the apartment, I believe, looking out the window.
At the end of the phone call, we hear you tell the 911 operator that you thought an officer was now arriving.
Yes.
Are you looking out the window to see that?
Yes.
How many officers arrived at first?
At first, only one.
Did you continue to look out the window to see what the officer did?
For a little bit, yes.
Tell us what you recall seeing the officer do.
The officer walked up with their flashlight and shined it all over the patio and the condo front, and then started knocking on the door.
Of your neighbor's apartment?
Of my neighbor's apartment, yes.
And did anybody answer the door?
No, not initially.
What happened then?
They continued to knock and call, like, for someone to come to the door. And then Cleo answered the door.
Were you looking out your window when you saw Cleo answer the door?
Yes.
Tell us what you recall seeing or hearing when Cleo answered the door for the officer.
When he answered the door, the officer said that they were there for a welfare check, kind of a conversation. And then he noticed blood on Cleo's hands and asked where it came from. And I heard Cleo say that it was a cut that he was cleaning up from. And then I walked away from that point.
While this is all happening, Natalie, is your front door open?
No.
Are any of your windows open?
No.
Are you close enough to the front door of your neighbor's apartment that you can still hear all this conversation?
Yes.
So after you hear Cleo kind of tell the officer that he had a cut and he cleaned up, then what happens?
I walked back to the back of the apartment and waited. I didn't see what happened, but I heard arguing. And then by the time I was back out there, Cleo was on the ground.
When you say back out there?
Back out by the windows looking.
And where on the ground was Cleo?
He was on the ground outside the door on the patio.
At this point, is there still just one officer or multiple officers?
At that point, there was only one officer.
Could you hear what either of them were saying at any point?
Cleo was escalated and upset and was saying some strange things.
Do you recall what kind of strange things?
Things about possibly working for Donald Trump or the FBI.
Did you see the officer tase Cleo?
I did not see that.
You talked earlier, Natalie, about prior to all of this that you had had a couple of conversations with Cleo, the defendant in this case. In your conversations with him, you said you guys talked about music. Did he ever say things like those kind of bizarre statements like Trump or the FBI?
No, he did not.
That night on December 17th, did you at some point, as well as Adam, speak with some police officers?
Yes,
How many times do you recall speaking to the police that night?
twice.
Where were you when the first officer talked to you?
The first officer talked to us inside of our condo.
And was that officer, I'm not going to ask you the name, I'm sure you don't
Yeah.
remember. Was that officer wearing a police uniform or were they wearing normal clothes?
A police uniform.
And do you recall, it's been a long time, but do you recall about how long you spoke to the officer for?
Probably about 5 to 10 minutes.
You said you spoke a second time with another officer?
Correct.
Where did that happen at?
After the incident, we went to my brother's apartment and the other officer came there.
Why did you go to your brother's apartment?
We didn't feel safe.
Did the police just kind of let you walk out and just walk to your car, or how did that work?
We checked with them if we were allowed to leave, and then they let us pack our stuff and they escorted us to our vehicles.
I didn't really ask this question, but at some point, did a lot more police officers show up?
Yes, a lot more arrived.
So they escort you and Adam out to the car, and you guys go to your brother's apartment?
Yes.
Sometime later that night after you get there, does another police officer speak to you?
Yes.
And if you recall, is that somebody wearing a police uniform or were they wearing normal clothes?
They were wearing normal clothes.
And did that officer or detective speak to you and Adam at the same time?
No.
How did it happen?
He had us in separate rooms and he interviewed us separately.
Were you cooperative?
Yes.
Did you tell both the officer and the second officer when you were at your brother's apartment what you recalled seeing and hearing?
Yes.
Did that second officer who spoke to you at the brother's apartment, did he record the conversation he had with you?
Yes, I believe so.
Before you testified today, did you have a chance to review a transcript of that conversation to help refresh your memory about what you told the police back then?
Yes, I did.
Just a couple of last questions, Natalie. When this all started that night and you said you were watching television in your living room and you hear the 3 or 4 popping sounds, did you hear anything unusual before that?
No.
At any point from the time you hear the popping sounds and look out your window until the time that the officer shows up, did you ever see anyone either leave or enter apartment 57 for your neighbors?
No, I did not.
One moment, Judge. I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you, Your Honor.
Counsel.
Time-wise, Judge.
Well, how long do you think you're going to take?
Probably about 15, 20 minutes, possibly, and then,
Well, at that rate, why don't we not break it in half? Why don't we just come back in the morning and do it all at once? So I didn't know if you were going to be real short or not. So, all right. First day of trial, that's a good chance for Elaine to go back and give everyone some final instructions, those kinds of things. Thank you for your attention today. Thank you for being here. We will start again at 10:30 in the morning. Remember the admonition, keep an open mind. To the extent there's news, just shut it off. Don't listen to it. Have a great evening. We'll see you in the morning.